326 years. That is how long one stretch of the west coast has stayed locked and silent, and that silence is now the longest in the entire 4,000-year record we can read. This week, the deep edge of that fault started shoving harder than it has in a month, just as a sunspot large enough to swallow several Earths turned to face us. And almost immediately the question wrote itself. Could the one in the sky set off the one in the ground? I went and got the real answer, mechanism by mechanism, and it is not the one most people are expecting, because once you take the sun out of the picture, what is left underneath the west coast is far more unsettling than any solar trigger could ever be. If you want the truth instead of the panic, do me a favour, and like this video and subscribe to the Sky Lab where we follow the data wherever it actually leads. Then drop a comment and tell me which fault line you live closest to, and whether you would know what to do in the first 10 seconds of a major quake. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The night the west coast went quiet. There is a stretch of the planet running from northern California up through Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia, where the ground has been silent for 326 years. That silence is not peace. It is the single most dangerous thing happening on the continent right now, and almost no one is looking directly at it, because this week the sky has been doing something loud enough to pull every eye upward instead. Let me tell you what is actually going on beneath the west coast tonight, because the two stories are about to collide in your newsfeed, and the way they get connected is going to be wrong. In the last 7 days, instruments buried along the southern end of one of the largest fault systems on Earth have recorded something close to 1,900 separate signals. Not earthquakes you could feel. Not anything that rattled a window or woke anyone up. These are tiny, almost ghostly tremors, and they cluster underneath Northern California and the southern edge of the zone in a way that, to the people who watch these maps for a living, looks like the highest count in about a month. The activity climbed sharply at the start of the week, and it has not really let go since. You would not know any of this from your morning. The coffee still brewed, the freeway still moved, and yet, roughly 40 miles down where the cold floor of the Pacific is being shoved underneath the edge of the continent, the deep part of that boundary has been slipping, quietly, steadily. And every time it slips down there, it presses a little harder on the part that has not moved in 3 centuries. That is the part I want you to hold on to because it is the whole story. There is a section of this fault that is stuck, locked, welded shut by friction and pressure. And the quiet slipping happening below it right now is not relieving the strain on that locked section, it is loading it, bringing it closer by some small measurable amount to the moment it finally tears free. Now here is where the sky comes in. At the very same time those tremor counts have been climbing, the sun has grown a sunspot so large and so tangled in its own magnetic field that space weather forecasters have raised the odds of a major explosion coming off of it. It is rotating, day by day, into a position where it points more and more directly at us. And the moment people saw a loaded fault and an angry sun in the same week, the question wrote itself. Could the one set off the other? Could a flash from 93 million miles away be the spark that finally lights the fuse under the west coast? I am going to answer that question tonight, completely and honestly, because the answer matters. But I want to be straight with you from the first minute, because this channel does not trade in fear it cannot back up. The honest answer is going to disappoint the people who want a cosmic trigger, and it is going to unsettle everyone else far more, because once you take the sun out of the picture, you are left staring at the real thing. The real thing is that this fault does not need a trigger. It never did. The strain is already there. The clock has already run longer than any clock we have a record of, and it will release on its own schedule, with or without a single thing happening in the sky above it. So tonight we are going to do something the headlines will not. We are going to look at both threats at once, the one in the ground and the one in the sky, and we are going to figure out which one is real, which one is theatre, and what it actually means that they happen to show up in the same week. If you have ever stood on the west coast and felt that low, unexamined assumption that the big one is somebody else's problem, somebody else's decade, I would gently ask you to set that down for the next while, because the data that came in this week does not care about that assumption at all. I think that assumption is worth examining for a second, because almost everyone carries some version of it, and it is the most dangerous thing in this entire story, more dangerous than the fault or the sun. The assumption goes like this. The big one has been talked about my whole life, and it has never come, so it is basically a story, a thing people say, not a thing that actually happens to actual people on an actual ordinary Tuesday. That feeling is completely understandable, because for everyone alive, it is technically true. No one living has experienced a great rupture on this coast. The entire lived experience of the region argues that the ground is stable. But notice the trap in that logic, because it is the exact same trap that catches every generation that lives through a long, quiet stretch before a rare disaster. The absence of the event in your lifetime is not evidence that the event will not happen. It is just evidence that you happen to live inside one of the gaps between events, which is where almost everyone who has ever lived on this coast has spent their entire life. The people going about their winter in the Pacific Northwest in the year 1699 carried the same assumption, and they were right up until the night of January 26, 1700, when they were very suddenly and catastrophically wrong. The quiet does not disprove the danger. The quiet is the danger wearing a convincing disguise. I want to slow down on those 1900 signals for a moment, because the word tremor makes them sound like little earthquakes, and they are not. A normal earthquake is a sudden snap, a release of stored stress in a violent instant. What is happening 40 miles down right now is the opposite of sudden. It is a slow, grinding, almost liquid kind of motion, where the deep part of the plate boundary slides by a few centimeters, over days or weeks instead of releasing in a second. The instruments do not even register it as shaking in the usual way. They pick it up as a faint, persistent hum, a seismic murmur that rises and falls, and as a slow drift in the position of the ground itself. Because that is the other thing we can measure. Up and down the west coast there are networks of precision instruments, satellite positioning stations that can track the location of a point on the ground to within millimeters, and buried sensors that feel the faintest strain in the rock. For most of the time, those stations show the coast being dragged slowly inland and upward, year after year, as the locked zone pulls the land along with the diving plate. But during one of these slow slip episodes, something strange happens. The drift briefly reverses. The deep slipping below lets the surface lurch the other way, a few millimeters, over a couple of weeks, and then it settles back. That reversal is the signature. That is how we know the deep boundary is moving even when no one feels a thing. The reason the people who watch these maps take a busy week seriously is that these episodes are not random noise. They happen on a rough cycle, and each one as it slips transfers a measurable load up onto the locked zone that has not moved. So when the count climbs to its highest level in about a month, concentrated under the southern end of the zone, it is not a prediction of anything, but it is the machine making itself heard. It is the part of the fault that can move, moving and pressing on the part that cannot. And I keep saying the southern end for a reason. The southern end of this zone, the part nearest Northern California, is also the part that sits closest to that other famous fault we will get to later, the one that runs down through the rest of California. When two great fault systems nearly touch, the place where they meet becomes the most interesting and the most fraught real estate on the entire west coast, because stress does not respect the neat lines we draw on maps. It bleeds from one system into the next. So an unusually busy week of deep slipping at exactly that junction is the kind of thing that makes a careful scientist sit up, not because it forecasts a date, but because it is happening in the one place where two giants share a fence line. None of this, I want to keep stressing, is visible from the surface of an ordinary day. That is the strangeness of it. The most consequential geological process on the continent is unfolding in total silence, registered only by machines, while the surface goes about its business. You could stand on that coastline this week, look out at a calm ocean, and have no sensory clue that anything beneath you had changed at all. The only way to know is to read the instruments, and the instruments this week are reading high. Let me show you what that silence is really made of, because to understand why 326 years is the scariest number in this entire story, you have to understand what is supposed to happen and how badly overdue we now are. The fault we are talking about has a name that sounds almost gentle, the Cascadia Subduction Zone. It does not look like the San Andreas, that famous crack you can stand on and photograph. Cascadia hides offshore underwater, running for something like 1,000 kilometers just off the coast, and it is built on a simple, brutal arrangement. One slab of the Earth's crust is sliding underneath another. The denser oceanic plate is being forced down beneath the lighter continental plate that you and millions of other people happen to live on. When that kind of boundary is healthy and slipping freely, you barely notice it. When it gets stuck, it becomes the most powerful kind of earthquake machine the planet can build. Every great earthquake in recorded history above magnitude 9 has come from exactly this kind of boundary, not from a crack like the San Andreas, from a subduction zone where one plate dives under another and then, after centuries of jamming, lets go all at once. Consider the membership of that club because it tells you what Cascadia is capable of. The largest earthquake ever measured by instruments was a magnitude 9.5 in Chile in 1960 on a subduction zone. The second largest was the magnitude 9.2 that struck Alaska in 1964 on a subduction zone. The earthquake that generated the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 was a subduction earthquake. The one that overwhelmed Japan in 2011 was a subduction earthquake. Every single one of the planet's recorded giants came from this same arrangement of one plate diving beneath another, and the reason is simple. Only a subduction zone can lock together a fault surface large enough, hundreds of kilometers long and 100 kilometers wide, to store the energy a magnitude 9 demands. A sideways crack like the San Andreas, for all its fame, simply cannot grow an earthquake that big. It does not have the surface area. Cascadia has that surface area. It has the full 1,000-kilometer length, the wide-locked interface, every ingredient the recorded giants had. The one thing that has made it seem less threatening than its Chilean or Alaskan or Japanese cousins is that none of us has ever seen it perform. The others ruptured within living memory, on camera, in the modern era, and so we treat them as real. Cascadia last ruptured before any modern nation existed on that coastline, which makes it feel historical, almost mythical. But the fault does not know that. To the rock, 3 centuries is nothing, a short pause between performances. It belongs to the same club as the giants, and it has simply been waiting longer than any of them between acts. And the southern end of Cascadia, the end closest to Northern California, is the end lighting up on the tremor maps tonight. That is not a coincidence I find comforting. Let me explain why. Part 2, 326 years. To understand the danger, you have to understand the rhythm, and to understand the rhythm, you have to understand that we know things about the deep past that we have no business knowing. We were not there, no one wrote it down, and yet we can tell you, with real confidence, almost exactly when this fault last let go, and roughly how often it has done so for thousands of years before that. The last time the Cascadia subduction zone ruptured along its full length was in the year 1700. We can be that precise, and the way we got that precision is one of the most remarkable pieces of detective work in all of Earth science. On a winter night in January of that year, the entire coast dropped and lurched, and the ocean responded by throwing a wall of water westward across the entire Pacific. About 9 or 10 hours later, that wave arrived in Japan, and the Japanese, who kept meticulous written records, documented a tsunami that flooded their villages with no earthquake felt beforehand. They called it the orphan tsunami, a wave with no parent, a wave whose earthquake had happened on the other side of the world. Centuries later, scientists matched that Japanese date to drowned forests along the American coast, to ghost stands of cedar killed when the land suddenly dropped and salt water rushed in, and to the oral histories of the indigenous nations who lived through it and passed the account down through generations. The tree rings, the written record in Japan, and the human memory all agreed. The night was the 26th of January, 1700. The earthquake was around magnitude 9. I do not want to rush past that human memory because it is one of the most remarkable parts of the whole record. The indigenous nations of the Pacific Northwest carried accounts of that night down through generations, stories of the ground shaking and the sea rising, and entire villages lost, passed along by word of mouth across the centuries, until scientists, much later, recognized that these were not myths, but eyewitness history. Some accounts described the shaking, some described whole canoes carried into the trees, some described villages that simply ceased to exist. When the written Japanese tsunami record, the dated dead trees, and these oral histories were finally laid side by side and found to agree, it was a quiet vindication of a knowledge that had been dismissed for too long. The people who were there told us what happened. It took the rest of us 3 centuries to learn how to listen, and when we did, every independent line of evidence pointed to the same winter night. That was 326 years ago, and here is the part that should make you sit forward. We do not just know about the last one, we know about the ones before it, going back something like 10,000 years, because the seafloor keeps its own diary. When a great earthquake shakes a subduction zone this size, it sends underwater landslides cascading down the slopes, and those landslides lay down a distinctive layer of sediment on the deep ocean floor. Layer after layer, each one a separate catastrophe, stacked in order like pages. On shore, the same events left buried marshes and sand sheets where tsunamis washed inland. Scientists have drilled into both, counted the pages, and dated them. What they found is that in the last 4,000 years, this fault has produced somewhere around 20 earthquakes of magnitude 8 or greater. Some were partial ruptures, breaking only a portion of the zone. Some were full-margin monsters like 1,700. And when you line up the gaps between them, you get an average rhythm, a rough heartbeat for the fault that lands somewhere in the range of a few centuries. Now hold that rhythm against the present. We are 326 years into the current gap, and according to that long record, that is the longest quiet stretch the fault has shown in the entire 4,000-year window we can read. The next longest interval anyone has documented was about 291 years. We are already past it. We are in uncharted territory, not in some speculative sense, but in the literal sense that the geologic diary has no page quite like this one. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where a less honest channel would tell you a date. So let me say plainly what I have always said. No one can predict an earthquake. Not me, not the people who study this for a living, not anyone with a website and a confident voice. Being overdue is not the same as being scheduled. A fault that averages a rupture every few centuries can stay quiet for longer, the way a kettle that usually whistles in 5 minutes can take 6. The average is not a promise, it is a tendency. But a tendency this far stretched is its own kind of warning. Think about what 326 years of locked silence actually means in terms of energy. Every year that the plate keeps converging, and it converges at roughly the speed your fingernails grow, the locked zone stores a little more strain. It bends, it compresses, it holds. For 3 centuries it has been holding, and nothing has come along to let any of it out. There has been no moderate earthquake on this part of the boundary to bleed off the pressure, no release valve, nothing. Just accumulation, year after year after year. When that finally reverses, when the locked zone can no longer hold what has been loaded onto it, it does not give back 300 years of strain politely. It gives it back in about 5 minutes, and the size of what comes out is set in large part by how much went in and how long the fault waited. We have waited longer than the record knows, so when I tell you the tremor counts climbed this week at the southern end of that very zone, you can maybe feel why I do not wave it away. By itself, a busy week of slow slip is not an alarm. These deep slipping episodes happen on their own slow cycle, and the overwhelming majority of them pass without anything dramatic following. But every single one of them, according to the researchers who model this boundary, adds a small increment of stress to the locked zone just upslope. Each quiet episode nudges the stuck part a little closer to its limit. The busy weeks are not the earthquake, they are the sound of the machine tightening. I want to linger on how we read that seafloor diary, because the more you understand the method, the harder it becomes to dismiss the conclusion. When a great earthquake shakes a continental margin this large, it does not just rattle the land. It shakes the steep underwater slopes off the coast so violently that loose sediment lets go and pours downhill in vast underwater avalanches. Those avalanches settle out on the deep ocean floor in a very particular kind of layer, coarse at the bottom, where the heavy grains fell first, fine at the top where the lightest particles drifted down last. Geologists have a name for these layers, and the important thing is that each one records a single, violent shaking event, and they stack up in order, oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top, like the rings of a tree or the pages of a ledger. When scientists pulled long cores of sediment from the deep floor off this coast and counted those layers, they found the record of dozens of great shaking events stretching back roughly 10,000 years. And when they compared cores taken from far apart along the margin, they found that many of the layers matched, top to bottom, the same events recorded hundreds of kilometers apart. That matching is what tells them an earthquake broke a long stretch of the fault all at once rather than a small piece of it. The full margin ruptures, the magnitude 9 class, leave their fingerprint up and down the entire coast at the same moment in the record. On land, the same catastrophes left a different kind of evidence. Along the coastal marshes of the Pacific Northwest, you can dig down and find buried soil, an old marsh surface that suddenly dropped below sea level and was entombed under a layer of sand carried in by a tsunami. Above it, the marsh slowly rebuilt, only to drop again in the next great earthquake, leaving another buried surface, another sand sheet. Stack those up, and you get the same story the seafloor tells, written in mud and sand instead of deep ocean sediment. And the dead trees, those ghost forests of cedar killed when the coast dropped and salt water poisoned their roots, can be dated by their rings to the exact season they died. That is how the 1700 event was pinned not just to a year, but to a winter. So when I say there have been around 20 great earthquakes here in the last 4,000 years, that number is not a guess. It is a count. It comes from the seafloor cores, the buried marshes, the dead forests, and the written tsunami record on the far side of the Pacific, all pointing at the same set of dates. The science of reading past earthquakes is one of the quiet triumphs of geology, because it lets us see a hazard that no living person has ever witnessed in this place. Not one human being alive today was here for the last full Cascadia rupture. The entire experience of the West Coast as a settled modern society has unfolded inside a single quiet interval. We have never seen this fault do the thing it is built to do, and that is exactly why the 326-year figure carries the weight it does. The intervals between those past ruptures were not identical. Some were shorter, a couple of centuries, a few stretched longer. The variability is real, and any honest account has to include it, because it is the reason no one can hand you a date. But when you take the full set of intervals and ask where the present gap falls, the present gap sits at the far end, past the longest one anyone has been able to document in the readable record. We are not merely due. We are, by the measure of the rock's own history, in unfamiliar territory. I want to be precise about what that word, overdue, does and does not license, because it gets abused in both directions. It does not mean the earthquake is scheduled, that a clock is counting down to a specific day, that the longer we wait, the more certain tomorrow becomes in some mechanical sense. Faults are not buses running late on a fixed timetable, but it also does not mean, as the dismissive crowd likes to claim, that because the big one has not come in our lifetimes it never will, that the warnings are just noise we can safely tune out. Both of those readings are wrong, and they are wrong in the same way, by treating a probability as if it were a promise, one promising disaster and the other promising safety. The honest framing is the uncomfortable middle. As the strain on a locked fault accumulates past its typical range, the likelihood that it fails in any given year does genuinely climb. Not to certainty, never to certainty, but upward, away from the low background odds of a freshly reset fault and toward the higher odds of one loaded beyond what the record shows. That is what 326 years buys you, not a date. A higher number on the dial of probability, and a fault that has moved out of the comfortable middle of its range and into the thin air at the edge of what it has ever been observed to hold. You do not need a date for that to demand your respect. You only need to understand that the dial has been turning one direction for 3 centuries, with nothing turning it back. I keep returning to one image to make sense of what that means. Imagine winding a clock spring tighter and tighter. For a while, each turn adds tension smoothly. But a spring has a limit, and as you approach it, you're no longer in the comfortable middle of its range. You're out near the edge of what it can hold, where the next turn matters more than the last. The Cascadia locked zone has been wound past every documented limit, and the deep slipping under Northern California this week is one more turn of the key. It does not tell us the spring breaks today. It tells us we are turning a spring that is already wound further than we have ever measured it. And that brings us back to the sky, and to the question everyone started asking the moment they saw a sunspot the size of several Earths swing into view at the same time these tremors spiked. If the fault is already this close to its limit, people are asking, then maybe it would not take much. Maybe it would only take a nudge from outside. Maybe it would only take the sun. So let us go up there and look at exactly what the sun is doing right now, because the thing that has turned to face us this week is genuinely one of the more impressive objects our star has produced in months, and you deserve to see it clearly before anyone tells you what it can and cannot do. Part 3. The machine beneath your feet. Before we go to the sun, I need you to be able to picture what is happening underground, because once you can see it, the rest of this story stops being abstract and starts being almost unbearably physical. Imagine a simple cross-section, a slice through the west coast from the ocean on the left to the mountains on the right. Out under the water sits the edge of the oceanic plate, and it is sliding eastward, downward, wedging itself underneath the continent. As that cold slab dives deeper and gets hotter, it eventually melts material above it, and that melt rises to feed the volcanoes you already know by name, the Cascades, the snow-capped peaks of Oregon and Washington and Northern California. So the volcanoes and the earthquakes are two outputs of the same engine. The same diving plate that builds the mountains is the one that loads the fault. Now follow that diving slab back toward the coast, up to where it is still relatively shallow. There is a band along that interface where the two plates are not sliding smoothly at all. They are stuck together. This is the locked zone, and it is the part that matters most, because it is the part that stores the energy and the part that breaks in a great earthquake. On the maps the experts use, you can draw a line through that locked zone, and along that line there is almost no small activity at all. It is eerily quiet. No tremor, no chatter, nothing. Just two slabs of the planet pressed together and holding. Below that locked band, deeper down the interface, you reach the zone where the plates do slip, but they slip slowly, almost gently, in those episodes of tremor we have been talking about. And that is exactly where this week's 1900 signals are coming from. Down at depth, beneath Northern California, the slab is creeping, and every increment it creeps transfers a push-up onto the locked zone above it. Picture two people leaning against opposite sides of the same door. The person on the bottom keeps shoving, a little at a time, but the latch up top is jammed and will not give. Every shove from below does not open the door, it just loads the latch. The latch holds and holds and holds, storing every bit of that force until the day it cannot, and then the door does not open gently. It bursts. I find it helps to put real distances on that image, because the scale is part of what makes a subduction earthquake so much larger than the quakes most people have felt. The locked latch we're talking about is not a small catch. It is a band of stuck plate boundary that runs for hundreds of kilometres along the coast and reaches tens of kilometres back from the shore, an enormous welded surface, all of it holding at once. When a smaller fault lets go, only a short segment moves. When this locked surface lets go, the tear can race along the entire length of it in those few minutes of shaking, each section breaking and handing its energy to the next, the rupture front travelling like a zipper down the coast at a speed faster than a jet. The size of an earthquake is essentially the size of the surface that breaks, and this surface is among the largest the planet can assemble. And the energy that comes out is not delivered as a single push, but as the sum of everything that was stored across that entire surface over 3 centuries of loading. That is why the shaking lasts not seconds, but minutes. A small fault snaps and is done. This boundary has so much locked area to unzip that the ground keeps moving long after a normal earthquake would have stopped. Long enough for the cascading failures we talked about, long enough for the coast to drop and the sea to begin its move inland. The door, when it finally bursts, is not a door at all. It is a wall the length of a coastline, and all of it gives way at once. That is the relationship between the quiet tremor below and the silent locked zone above. The tremor is the shoving, the locked zone is the latch. And researchers who study this boundary have been remarkably direct about what the shoving does. The way they put it is that each slow slip event adds stress to the adjacent locked zone, bringing it closer to failure. Not maybe, not in theory. Each episode is a measurable step toward the threshold. I want to stress the honest limit of that statement, because it would be easy to twist. A slow slip episode loading the locked zone does not mean the next episode breaks it. These deep slipping events come and go on their own slow clock, and the fault has absorbed thousands of them across its history without rupturing on any particular one. So when you see a busy tremor week, the correct reading is not the big one is tomorrow. The correct reading is the machine just took another step, and the machine is already standing closer to the edge than it has at any point in the readable record. And there is one more feature of this particular machine that makes the southern end the part I cannot stop watching. The strain does not just sit politely under the ocean. It deforms the land you can walk on. Up and down this coast, precise instruments have measured the ground, slowly bulging, the coastline squeezed and lifted as the locked zone drags it along. when the rupture finally comes, that built-up bulge reverses in an instant. The coast that has been slowly rising will drop, in some places by a metre or more in seconds. Marshes will become bays. Forests will drown, exactly as they did in 1700, leaving the same ghost stands of dead cedar for some future scientist to date. Now place people on top of this machine, because that is what makes it more than a geology lesson. The locked zone we have been describing does not run under empty country. It runs offshore of a coastline where millions of people live, work, raise children, and go about lives built on the quiet assumption that the ground is the one thing they never have to think about. Coastal cities, port towns, fishing communities, the corridor of highways and rail and pipelines that stitches the Pacific Northwest together, all of it sits on top of, or just inland from, the loaded boundary. The thing that is tightening this week is not tightening in a wilderness. It is tightening beneath one of the more populated and economically vital stretches of the continent. And the people living there feel nothing, which is the strangest and most human part of this whole story. The same precise instruments that registered this week's surge show, on an ordinary day, the entire coastline being squeezed and bent like a slow-loading spring, the land near the coast actually rising by a few millimetres a year as the locked zone drags it along. A person standing on that coast is, in a real and measurable sense, being lifted and compressed by the same force that will one day be released in catastrophe. But it happens at the speed of growing fingernails, far too slowly for any nerve to detect, and so the most consequential physical process in the region is also the most completely invisible to the people living through it. That invisibility is the enemy here, more than the fault itself. We are very good, as a species, at reacting to threats we can see and feel, a storm on the horizon, a fire, a flood rising in the street. We are terrible at staying braced for a threat that gives no daily sign, that asks us to take action now against something that has not happened in anyone's memory and may not happen this year or this decade. The locked zone exploits that weakness perfectly. It offers no rumble, no warning tremor, no visible change, nothing for the senses to lock onto, just 3 centuries of perfect stillness that lulls each new generation into treating the danger as someone else's distant problem. The machine's deadliest feature is not its power, it is its silence. So this is the machine. A plate diving, building mountains on one side and storing catastrophe on the other. A locked latch that has not slipped in 3 centuries, and a deep zone that this week has been shoving harder than it has in a month. None of that requires the sun. None of that requires anything from the sky at all. The danger is entirely homegrown, entirely terrestrial, and entirely sufficient on its own. There is a name for the rhythm of that deep slipping, and it is worth knowing because it reveals how regular and how studied this process actually is. Scientists call it episodic tremor and slip. Episodic, because it comes in episodes rather than continuously. Tremor, for that faint seismic hum, and slip, for the few centimetres of quiet motion on the deep boundary. Along parts of this margin, these episodes recur with surprising regularity, returning every so often like a slow seasonal tide, each one lasting days to weeks before fading. They are so consistent that researchers can roughly anticipate the next window, not the next earthquake, but the next pulse of deep creep. And every one of those pulses as it slips leans a little harder on the locked zone above. Here is the part that should give you pause. For a long time, conventional thinking held that the deep, slow slip was mostly a release valve, a harmless way for the boundary to let off steam. More recent work has reframed it as something less comforting, as a process that concentrates stress onto the locked zone rather than relieving it. In other words, the very thing some people would point to and say, see, the fault is letting go gently is actually, in the parts that matter, doing the opposite. It is the bottom of the door being shoved while the latch up top stays jammed. The gentle motion below is buying the violent motion above. I think about a hard lesson the planet taught us not long ago, on the other side of the Pacific. For years, the stretch of subduction zone off northeastern Japan was thought to be incapable of producing the very largest earthquakes. The assumption was that it would release its stress in moderate, manageable pieces. Then, in 2011, that same boundary ruptured in a magnitude 9, generated a tsunami that overran seawalls built for something far smaller, and caused one of the great disasters of the century. The fault did not behave the way the prevailing assumption said it would. It behaved the way the rock wanted to behave, and the assumption was simply wrong. That memory hangs over every conversation about Cascadia, because Cascadia is the same kind of boundary, with the same capacity and a far longer silence behind it. So when I look at the cross-section, at the diving plate and the locked latch, and the deep slipping that is running hot this week beneath Northern California, I am not looking at an abstraction. I am looking at the exact configuration that has produced the largest earthquakes the planet can make, in a place that has been storing its energy longer than the records can match, with the deep engine pressing harder right now than it has in a month. And I am remembering that the last time we assumed one of these boundaries would be merciful, it was not. Which is exactly why I find the next part of the story so interesting, because while all of this has been happening underground, our star decided to put on a display directly overhead, and the timing was good enough to fool a lot of people into connecting two things that are not connected. Let us go look at what is actually up there. Part 4. The spot that turned to face us. If you could safely look at the sun right now through the right kind of filtered telescope, the first thing you would notice is a dark, sprawling blemish near the centre of the disk, and it is enormous. This is the Sunspot region that has space weather forecasters paying close attention this week, and it has earned the attention. A sunspot is not a hole, and it is not cold in any ordinary sense. It is a place where the sun's magnetic field has become so concentrated and so tangled that it chokes off the normal upward flow of heat, leaving a patch that is cooler than its surroundings, and therefore looks dark against the blaze. The bigger and more twisted that magnetic knot becomes, the more energy it can store, and the more violently it can let that energy go. When one of these knots snaps and reorganizes, you get a solar flare, a flash of radiation, and sometimes a coronal mass ejection, a billion-ton cloud of magnetized plasma flung outward into space. The sun does this constantly, on an 11-year cycle of activity, ramping up to a stormy peak, and then settling toward a quiet minimum before climbing again. We have been moving through one of those active stretches, which is why the past couple of years have brought so many auroras to places that rarely see them, and so many headlines about solar storms. A large tangled region like the one facing us this week is exactly what an active sun produces, and it is a reminder that our star is not the steady, unchanging lamp it appears to be on a clear afternoon. It is a churning, magnetic, violent thing, and it goes through moods. The region everyone is watching this week is large. We're talking about a sunspot group with an area on the order of well over 1,000 millionths of the solar disk, made up of around 24 individual spots, and classified with a particular label that makes solar physicists lean in. It carries what is called a delta configuration, which is shorthand for the most volatile arrangement a sunspot can have, where magnetic fields of opposite polarity are crowded together into the same dark core, north and south jammed so close that the field between them is twisted to the breaking point. Those are the regions that produce the largest flares, and this one is not small. The forecasters have put real numbers on it. Over a 3-day window, they have placed the odds of a moderate flare from this part of the sun fairly high, and the odds of a major top-class X flare at around 10%. 10% may not sound dramatic, but for a single region over a few days, it is the kind of number that gets space weather officers to write it down and watch closely. Earlier in the week, the sun had already fired off a strong flare from a region near its edge, and the stream of high-energy electrons around the Earth had climbed to elevated levels. That electron stream is worth a word because it is one of the quieter hazards of an active sun. When the flux of high-energy electrons around the planet climbs and stays high for days, those particles can work their way deep into the electronics of satellites and slowly build up electrical charge inside components, until a tiny internal spark damages the hardware. Satellite operators have a name for this, deep dielectric charging, and it is a real and ongoing concern during weeks like this one, when the readings stay elevated. None of that, of course, has any bearing on a fault in the ground. It is simply another example of the genuine, specific, well-understood ways the sun reaches us, all of which happen in orbit and in the atmosphere and in our technology, and none of which happen in the locked rock of a plate boundary. So the inventory of what this sunspot can actually do is real and not small. It can disrupt radio, it can degrade navigation, it can charge and damage satellites, it can stress the long wires of the power grid, it can throw auroras across the night. Every item on that list is a genuine reason to watch it. The only thing missing from the list, The one thing it cannot do, no matter how large it grows or how directly it turns to face us, is reach down and move the ground. There is also a cloud of plasma already in transit, launched a few days ago, with at least part of it aimed loosely in our direction, and an expected arrival around the end of the month. And here is the detail that turned this from a space weather story into a supposed earthquake story. The big region is still rotating. Right now it sits off-center, and as the sun turns on its axis, that region is swinging steadily toward the position where it would point most directly at Earth. So the watchers describe it the way you would describe something coiled and waiting. A complex, oversized magnetic knot growing, holding its charge, turning slowly to face us with the odds of a major eruption ticking upward as it comes around. It is worth saying that watching this region is genuinely worthwhile, just for the right reasons. A complex sunspot rotating into view is the kind of thing that can hand us a real show, throwing auroras down to latitudes that rarely see them, and giving the people who chase those lights a night they will remember. It can also genuinely threaten the machinery of modern life, the satellites we depend on for navigation and communication, the power grids that span continents, the radio links that aircraft and ships still rely on over the poles and oceans. Those are real stakes, and the forecasters tracking this region are doing important work. So when I say the sun cannot touch the fault, I am not saying ignore the sun. I am saying watch it for what it actually does, which is plenty rather than for a power it does not have. And history gives us a yardstick for how seriously to take a region like this. The largest geomagnetic storm in recorded history struck in the 1850s, when a powerful solar eruption hit a world that had just started stringing telegraph wires across the land, and those wires sparked and shocked their operators, and in some cases caught fire. A storm of that size hitting today's far more wired civilization is one of the genuine low-probability, high-consequence risks that space weather scientists prepare for. So a big, complex, Earth-facing sunspot is absolutely something to respect. The mistake is not respecting the sun. The mistake is aiming that respect at the wrong target, at a fault 40 kilometers underground that the sun has no way to reach. I understand completely why that image lands the way it does. You have a fault underground that we just spent 20 minutes establishing is loaded to a historic degree. And now, overhead, you have what looks like a loaded gun in the sky slowly rotating until the barrel points at the same coastline. The human brain is a pattern-finding machine, and it does not like coincidences. It wants the two loaded things in the same week to be part of one story. It wants the sun to be the finger on the trigger. Let me give that instinct its full due before I take it apart, because the people asking this question are not foolish. They are doing exactly what good pattern recognition does. They have noticed two real, simultaneous escalating phenomena and asked whether one causes the other. That is a legitimate question. It deserves a real answer rather than a smug dismissal. So I went and got the real answer, and I want to walk you through it the way the science actually works, mechanism by mechanism, because the conclusion is firm, and the reasoning behind it is something you can carry with you the next time someone online tells you a solar flare is about to crack the continent. Let me make sure you understand what this region can actually do, because the real powers of a sunspot like this are impressive enough that we do not need to invent fake ones. Solar flares are sorted into classes by their strength, and the labels climb like the steps of an alphabet. The smallest meaningful ones are C-class. A step up, about 10 times stronger, are M-class, moderate flares that can cause radio problems on the sunlit side of the planet. And at the top are X-class flares, the giants, each one capable of releasing as much energy in minutes as our entire civilization uses across a long stretch of time. The region turning to face us this week has been given roughly a 1 in 10 chance of producing one of those top-class X flares over a 3-day window, and a much higher chance of the moderate ones. For a single region over a few days, those are numbers worth respecting. A flare itself is a flash of radiation travelling at the speed of light, which means when one happens, the effects on the sunlit side of Earth arrive almost instantly, mostly as a disturbance to the upper atmosphere that can black out high-frequency radio and degrade navigation signals. But the bigger story is often what comes after the flash. When the sun's tangled magnetic field snaps and reorganizes, in a process called magnetic reconnection, it can hurl an enormous cloud of magnetized plasma out into space, a coronal mass ejection weighing on the order of 1 billion tons. That cloud does not travel at the speed of light. It takes a day or more to cross the Gulf to Earth, and if it arrives aimed the right way, it can rattle our planet's magnetic field hard enough to push electrical currents through power lines, threaten the most exposed transformers, drag on satellites in low orbit, and paint auroras across skies far from the poles. This week there is already such a cloud in transit, launched a few days ago, with at least part of it loosely aimed our way, expected to arrive around the end of the month. On its own, it is not forecast to be a monster. The geomagnetic activity around the planet has actually been on the quiet side, and the official outlook does not call for a severe storm. But the reason forecasters keep their eyes on this particular sunspot is not the cloud already in flight. It is the region itself, that oversized, magnetically twisted knot, growing and holding its charge as it rotates into the position where anything it throws would come straight at us. And that is the image that hijacked the conversation. A coiled, oversized magnetic structure, swinging slowly around until it points directly at the west coast, at the very week a loaded fault started shoving harder underground. I called it a knot turning to face us, and the people who started asking about earthquakes used sharper language. They described it the way you would describe a predator settling into position, holding still, lining up the shot. I understand the pull of that picture completely. When two ominous things rotate into alignment in the same week, the mind insists they must be parts of one mechanism. But everything I just described about the sun is about energy delivered to the upper atmosphere, to orbit, to the power lines strung across the surface. None of it is about energy delivered to a locked fault tens of kilometers down in solid rock. But before we test the claim, notice what we are really doing here. We're about to take the more dramatic of the two threats, the one in the sky, and find out whether it has any power over the ground at all. And if the answer turns out to be no, then everything swings back to the fault. And the fault, remember, did not need the sun in the first place. So which is it? Can a flash from our star reach across 93 million miles and move a locked plate boundary? Let us find out. Part 5. Can the sun pull the trigger? The claim goes like this. A powerful solar flare or a coronal mass ejection slams into the Earth, the planet's magnetic field convulses, electrical currents surge through the ground, and somewhere a fault that was already near its limit gets the final push it needed. People point to moments in history when a big solar storm and a big earthquake happened within a few days of each other, and they ask the obvious question. What if that was not a coincidence? It is a fair question, so let us actually weigh it, and the cleanest way to weigh it is with energy, because earthquakes are, at their core, a problem of energy. A locked fault is a battery. It has spent centuries charging, storing elastic strain in the bent rock on either side of it. A great subduction earthquake releases an amount of energy that is genuinely hard to hold in your head. We measure it on a scale where each single step up in magnitude means about 32 times more energy released. So a magnitude 9 does not release a little more than a magnitude 7. It releases something like 1,000 times more. The energy stored in the locked Cascadia zone right now is on the order of what the entire planet's power grids would put out, over a span of time you would measure in years. Now compare that to what a solar storm actually delivers into the solid Earth. A geomagnetic storm is genuinely powerful in its own domain. It can push electrical currents through long power lines, knock satellites off course, light up the sky with auroras, even damage transformers. But the energy it couples into the rock kilometers underground, where a fault is locked, is almost laughably small by comparison. We are not talking about a difference of a little. We are talking about a difference of many factors of 10, the kind of gap where you would need the solar effect to be millions or billions of times stronger than it is before it could matter to a fault that is already straining under centuries of stored force. Think of it this way. You have a boulder balanced at the very edge of a cliff, and it has been creeping toward that edge for 300 years. Someone asks whether a moth landing on it could be what finally sends it over, and technically, in some abstract sense, every gram counts. But the honest answer is that the boulder was going over on its own and the moth is not the story. The sun, when it comes to a locked fault, is the moth. The strain in the rock is the 300 years of creep. And we have a perfect natural control experiment for this, one that runs every single day, which is the moon. The moon pulls on the entire Earth twice a day, raising tides not just in the ocean, but in the solid rock of the planet itself, flexing the crust by a small but real amount on a relentless, predictable schedule. If any modest external force could tip a loaded fault over its edge, the daily tidal pull of the moon would be the obvious candidate, because it is far more consistent and, on the crust, far more substantial than anything a solar storm delivers. Scientists have looked, carefully and for a long time, at whether great earthquakes cluster with the tides, and what they find is, at most, a faint and inconsistent whisper of an effect on certain very specific kinds of faults, and nothing remotely like a reliable trigger for the great ones. If the moon, pulling on the whole planet every day for billions of years, cannot reliably set off the big earthquakes, then a sunspot 93 million miles away, throwing the occasional storm in our general direction, has no chance at all. The control experiment has already been run, on repeat, for the entire history of the Earth, and the answer is no. But energy is not the only way to check this, so let's look at the actual record, because if the sun really did trigger earthquakes, we would see it in the numbers. We have decades of detailed global earthquake catalogues and decades of detailed solar and geomagnetic measurements sitting right next to each other, just waiting to be compared. And scientists have compared them many times, looking for the fingerprint, looking for any robust pattern where big quakes cluster reliably after solar storms. What they keep finding is nothing. No consistent, repeatable correlation that holds up when you account for how often big earthquakes and big solar storms each happen anyway. With enough events on both sides, some of them are going to fall near each other by pure chance, the same way some lightning strikes happen to land near someone's birthday. The coincidences exist. The causal link does not. The agency responsible for monitoring earthquakes in the United States has addressed this directly, and their position is unambiguous. There is no established physical mechanism by which solar activity triggers earthquakes. It is not that they have refused to look. It is that the looking keeps coming up empty, and the physics keeps saying it should. So I am going to give you the firm answer this channel has given before and will keep giving, because the data has not changed. The sun does not trigger earthquakes. The sunspot turning to face us this week is a real and genuinely impressive thing, and it is worth watching for what it can actually do, which is disrupt radio, endanger satellites, stress the power grid, and throw beautiful auroras across the night sky. What it cannot do is reach down through 93 million miles of space and tens of kilometers of rock and unlock the Cascadia Fault. Those are two separate stories that happen to buy tickets to the same week. I want to be fair to the specific mechanisms people propose, because dismissing an idea without engaging it is its own kind of dishonesty. The most common proposed pathway is through those geomagnetically induced currents, the same electrical currents a solar storm pushes through long conductors. The idea is that if those currents flow through the crust, they might somehow lubricate or destabilize a fault. The trouble is the scale. The currents that threaten a continent-spanning power line are diffuse and shallow by the standards of a fault zone, and by the time you get down to where rock is locked under crushing pressure, the electrical effect is vanishingly small compared to the mechanical stress already stored there. A second proposed pathway is piezomagnetism, the fact that stressed rock can slightly change its magnetic properties, but that runs the causality backwards. It means a building earthquake might produce a tiny magnetic signal, not that a magnetic signal produces an earthquake. People sometimes see that relationship and read it in the wrong direction. A third idea is some direct electromagnetic coupling between solar activity and the crust. And here the problem is simply that no one has demonstrated a mechanism that delivers anything close to the energy required. Every one of these pathways runs into the same wall we hit with the boulder and the moth. The strain energy in a locked great fault is so enormous that any plausible solar contribution is lost in the noise, smaller than the daily tug of the moon's tides on the crust, and we do not see the moon triggering great earthquakes either, despite the moon pulling on the entire planet twice a day, every day, forever. There is also a simple test of the idea that does not require any physics at all, just bookkeeping. If solar activity triggered great earthquakes, then great earthquakes should cluster around the peaks of the sun's 11-year cycle, when flares and storms are most common, and they should thin out during solar minimum when the sun goes quiet for years at a time. That is not what we see. Some of the largest earthquakes in recorded history struck during periods when the sun was calm, during the quiet years of the cycle when flares were rare and storms were absent. The ground does not check the space weather forecast before it ruptures. It does not know or care what the sun is doing on the day it finally lets go. It answers only to its own stored stress, to the slow accounting of strain that has been building for centuries and that accounting runs entirely independent of anything happening 93 million miles away. It ruptures when its own stored stress crosses its own threshold, and that threshold has nothing to do with what our star is doing that week. I think it helps to name why this myth is so sticky, because understanding that is its own protection. Our brains are built to find patterns, and they are especially eager to connect two frightening things that show up together. When a big solar storm and a big earthquake fall in the same news cycle, the coincidence feels meaningful, and the feeling is powerful enough to override the arithmetic. But with enough earthquakes and enough solar storms happening all the time, some of them are going to land near each other by pure chance, the same way that if you flip enough coins, you will eventually get a long run of heads that looks like a pattern but is not. The honest discipline is to ask not whether two things ever coincided, but whether they coincide more often than chance would produce. And when researchers run that test across decades of global data, the answer keeps coming back the same. No more often than chance, no fingerprint, no signal. I want to take a moment on why getting this right actually matters, because it is not just about being correct for its own sake. When fear gets pointed at the wrong target, it does real harm. Every hour someone spends watching the sun for a sign that an earthquake is coming is an hour not spent doing the things that would actually keep them safe, the boring, effective preparation we will get to. Worse, when the predicted solar trigger does not produce an earthquake, and it never will, the people who are frightened feel foolish, and the next time someone raises a real concern about the fault, they tune it out. False alarms do not just waste attention, they burn down the credibility that real warnings depend on. A community that has been told a dozen times that the sun is about to crack the earth and seen nothing happen is a community that has been trained to ignore the very real thing happening under its feet. There is also a quieter cost, which is that the cosmic trigger story steals agency. If you believe a solar flare is going to set off the big one, then your safety depends on watching the sky and hoping, on forces utterly beyond your control. But if you understand that the danger is a loaded fault that will release on its own schedule, then the response is entirely in your hands. You cannot control when it comes, but you can control whether your home is ready, whether your family has a plan, whether you know the reflex that saves lives in the first seconds. The truthful story is the empowering one, because it points you toward the things you can actually do, instead of toward a sky you can only stare at. So I will say it one more time, plainly, because it is the load-bearing conclusion of this entire video. The sun is real, the sunspot is real, the storm risk is real, and none of it can unlock a fault. The agency that monitors earthquakes in the United States has looked at this question directly and stated that there is no established mechanism by which solar activity sets off earthquakes. That is not a shrug. That is the considered position after the looking has been done, and now I have to deliver the part that is genuinely more disturbing than any solar trigger could ever be. Because some people, when they hear that the sun is not the cause, relax. They shouldn't. Taking the sun out of the equation does not make the fault safer. It makes the fault the entire problem. There is no external villain here, no cosmic spark we can watch for and time. There is just a locked zone, loaded past the longest interval in the record, that will release whenever its own internal threshold is crossed, and that threshold gives no countdown. We were never waiting on the sun. We have been waiting on the rock the whole time, and the rock keeps its own counsel. So if the trigger is not in the sky, then where should we actually be looking? And what does it mean that this same week, all the way around the planet, the ground has been unusually busy? Because that part is real too, and it tells us something true about how earthquakes do influence each other, once you throw out the part about the sun. Part 6. The week the plates moved. Here is something that is genuinely true and worth sitting with. This has been an active week for earthquakes around the world, and not in a vague way, in a way you can count. In the span of just a few days, the planet produced a magnitude 6.5 off the southern Philippines, a strong jolt at a moderate depth in a region already rattled by a larger event not long before. It produced a magnitude 6.1 beneath the Hindu Kush, near the border country of Afghanistan, and that one was deep, around 200 kilometers down, the kind of event that gets felt across several countries at once, but, because of its depth, tends to spare the surface the worst of its violence. Around the same window there was a run of deep earthquakes scattered across the southwest Pacific, beneath the Banda Sea, beneath Timor, beneath Fiji, some of them more than 500 kilometers down in the part of the descending slab that has plunged so far into the earth that the rock behaves in ways we are still working to understand. There was a strong shake in eastern Japan as well. That is a lot of significant movement in a short stretch, and the people who track this closely have noted that having multiple major earthquakes inside a single week is, while not unheard of, on the busier end of normal. The magnitude 6.5 off the southern Philippines is a good example of why context matters, because it did not strike a calm region. It struck a stretch of the boundary that had already been jolted by a larger earthquake not long before, which means a good portion of this week's activity there is the tale of an ongoing aftershock sequence, the boundary still settling after a bigger break. That is not a new mystery. That is a fault doing exactly what faults do after they rupture, redistributing stress to its neighbours and shaking itself out over the following weeks. The deep magnitude 6.1 beneath the Hindu Kush tells a different and older story. That part of the world sits where the Indian subcontinent has been ramming into the rest of Asia for tens of millions of years. The collision that built the highest mountains on the planet, and the earthquakes there can originate hundreds of kilometres down in slabs of crust that were dragged deep long ago and are still breaking under unimaginable pressure. An earthquake that deep is felt across several countries at once, a long rolling motion rather than a sharp jolt, which is exactly why it can register as significant on the instruments while doing little damage at the surface. Every one of these events has its own context, its own depth, its own place in a longer regional story, and lumping them together into a single sense of the planet is breaking down loses all of that texture. So let me handle this carefully, because here is where a different myth lives, the mirror image of the solar one. A lot of people believe that earthquakes are entirely independent, that one quake here has nothing to do with another quake there, that the planet just rolls dice. And that belief is just as wrong as the solar trigger belief, only in the opposite direction. Because earthquakes absolutely can influence other earthquakes. That part is real, well established, and central to how this science works. When a fault ruptures, it does two things to its neighbours. First, the shaking itself, the seismic waves rolling outward, can give distant faults a literal jolt, and a fault already near its limit can be nudged into slipping by waves passing through, even from thousands of kilometres away. Second, and more lastingly, when a chunk of crust moves in an earthquake, it changes the stress on the rock around it. It loads some nearby faults and unloads others, redrawing the pressure map of the entire region. This is not fringe speculation. It is the backbone of how aftershocks work, and it has been mapped in detail in cases where one earthquake clearly handed stress to a neighbour, which then failed in turn. So when forecasters watch one large quake and immediately start watching the faults around it, they are not being superstitious. They are reading a real and physical chain of cause and effect. Notice the difference, though, and notice it sharply, because this is the whole point. Earthquakes triggering earthquakes is fault to fault, rock to rock through the solid earth, with enormous and comparable amounts of energy on both sides of the exchange. The sun triggering an earthquake would be sky to rock, across an energy gap of 1 billion to 1. One of these is how the planet actually works. The other is a coincidence wearing a costume. So when you watch a busy seismic week and feel that something is connected, you are not wrong to feel it. You are just pointing the feeling at the wrong suspect. The connections run along the plate boundaries, not down from the sky. And once you start tracing those earthly connections, you see why certain places are on the watch list right now. Look at the eastern edge of the Caribbean, where a cluster of moderate quakes has been ticking up. A magnitude 5 near the Dominican Republic, another near Guadeloupe. That region sits on its own subduction zone, and it has history. It produced an earthquake estimated near magnitude 8.5 in the 1840s, and a strong one in the 1970s. The arithmetic there is the same arithmetic as Cascadia, just on a different clock. Stress has been building on that boundary for the better part of 2 centuries with no great release, and a recent uptick in smaller events is the kind of thing that makes seismologists pay attention without making predictions. Look at Pakistan, where a sequence began with a magnitude 5.2 and grew to a 5.4 near the same stretch of plate boundary. A sequence that starts small and steps upward is sometimes the prelude to something larger, what we would call a foreshock pattern. Most of the time it is not. But the only way to know which kind you're looking at is in hindsight. which is precisely why an honest analyst flags it as worth watching rather than declares it a warning. Look at the Gulf of Alaska, where this week brought a magnitude 4.9 near the Kenai Peninsula and another shake closer to Anchorage. That coastline sits on the megathrust that produced the second largest earthquake ever recorded, the magnitude 9.2 that devastated Alaska in 1964. Even places far inland are not exempt, and there are old, slow fault systems across the interior west, including areas out near Nevada, that have been showing flickers of life after long quiet. Now stand back and look at all of it at once. The Philippines, the Hindu Kush, the Southwest Pacific, the Eastern Caribbean, Pakistan, Alaska. The pattern is not that the sun lit a fuse around the world. The pattern is that the planet is a single interlocking shell of plates, all pressing on one another, all storing strain, all on their own clocks, and that several of those clocks happen to be running late at the same time. That is not mysticism. That is plate tectonics, doing exactly what it does. Let me clear up two things about this busy week that get distorted constantly, because the distortions feed straight into the fear. The first is about those deep earthquakes, the ones beneath the Hindu Kush, and the Southwest Pacific that struck hundreds of kilometers down. People hear a magnitude 6 or a magnitude 5.9 and brace for a disaster, but depth changes everything. An earthquake 200 kilometers down has to send its energy up through that much rock before it reaches anyone, and it arrives at the surface spread out and softened, felt across a huge area, but rarely destructive. A deep earthquake also cannot make a tsunami, because it does not deform the seafloor. So the deep events in this week's cluster are scientifically fascinating, telling us about slabs of old ocean floor sinking far into the planet, but they are not the ones that flatten cities. It is the shallow earthquakes on the locked parts of subduction zones, the ones near the surface, that carry the real destructive and tsunami-making power. That is why a shallow locked zone like Cascadia sits in a different category of threat than a deep jolt under Central Asia, even at a similar magnitude. The second thing I want to correct is the feeling that the whole planet is suddenly waking up, that the Earth is somehow more active than it used to be. I understand why it feels that way. When you watch the maps every day, a week with multiple large earthquakes feels like an acceleration. But the honest statistical picture is that the global rate of large earthquakes is, year over year, remarkably steady. The planet produces, on average, more than a dozen magnitude 7 earthquakes a year, and a handful of magnitude 8s, and they do not space themselves out politely. They clump. A run of big quakes in 1 week followed by a quiet stretch is exactly what randomness looks like, the same way rain does not fall in evenly spaced drops. So when someone tells you the Earth is breaking down, the careful answer is no, the Earth is doing what it always does, and our attention, amplified by how connected we now are, is what has changed. We hear about every event now, instantly, from everywhere. That distinction matters, because it keeps us pointed at the real signal instead of the noise. The real signal is not that the global rate has jumped. The real signal is that several specific, named boundaries are individually late in their own cycles, and that is a different and more useful kind of concern. The Eastern Caribbean is one. That subduction zone produced an earthquake estimated near magnitude 8.5 in the 1840s, and a strong one in the 1970s, and the strain has been quietly rebuilding ever since, with this week's cluster of moderate quakes near the Dominican Republic and Guadeloupe a reminder that the boundary is alive. The arithmetic there is the same arithmetic we have been doing for the West Coast, just on a different clock and a different coastline. A boundary that produced an 8.5 in the 1840s has now gone the better part of 2 centuries, and the islands and shorelines around it are far more populated than they were the last time it let go. It is one more place where the strain has been accumulating with no great release, one more clock running late, one more spot a careful watcher keeps on the list without ever claiming to know the day. I point that out not to pile on more dread, but because it sharpens the central point of tonight. The planet is full of these loaded boundaries, each on its own schedule, each storing energy in silence. That is the normal, permanent condition of a living, tectonically active world. The reason the West Coast sits at the very top of the watch list is not that it is the only loaded fault. It is that it combines the longest silence, the largest possible earthquake, the densest exposed population, and this week, a deep boundary that has been shoving harder than it has in a month. Out of all the clocks running late around the world, that is the one closest to its alarm, under the most people capable of the most. Pakistan is another, where a sequence climbing from a magnitude 5.2 to a 5.4 sites on a complicated collision zone that has produced devastating earthquakes across the past century, and where a step-by-step rise in magnitude is the kind of thing that occasionally precedes something larger, though far more often it does not. Alaska is a third. The Gulf of Alaska is one of the great earthquake factories on Earth. The same megathrust that in 1964 produced a magnitude 9.2, the second largest earthquake ever measured, and this week's moderate jolts near the Kenai Peninsula and Anchorage are a small reminder that the factory is still running. And even far from any plate boundary, in the interior west, old fault systems that have been quiet for a very long time, including some out toward Nevada, have shown flickers of activity because stress does not only live at the edges of plates, it seeps inland, loading ancient faults that most people have never heard of. This is also the right place to explain the one kind of forecasting that earthquake scientists actually can do, because it sits right at the line between honesty and overreach. They cannot tell you the day a fault will rupture. But once a large earthquake happens, they can say a great deal about what comes next, because aftershocks follow rules. After any sizable earthquake, the region around it produces a flurry of smaller quakes that decays in a predictable way over the following days and weeks, and there is always a small quantifiable chance that one of those aftershocks turns out to be even larger than the first event, in which case we relabel the first one a foreshock. That is why, when a sequence like the one in Pakistan steps upward from a magnitude 5.2 to a 5.4, a careful analyst does not predict a larger quake, but does say the odds of one in the next little while are temporarily elevated above the everyday background. That is real, defensible forecasting. It is probabilistic, it is short-term, and it never names a day. The difference between that and prediction is the whole ballgame. Prediction says a magnitude 8 will strike this fault on this date, and no one on Earth can do it, no matter how confident they sound. Forecasting says, given what just happened here, the probability of a significant quake in this region over the next week is higher than usual, and that is genuinely useful. The same way a weather forecast that says 70% chance of rain is useful without claiming to know the exact minute the first drop falls. When you hear someone give you a date and a magnitude for a future earthquake, you are hearing prediction, and you're hearing someone who has stepped outside what the science can support. When you hear someone say a zone is loaded and worth watching, you are hearing forecasting, and you are hearing someone being honest about both what we know and what we cannot. When you lay all of that out, the picture is not of a planet in chaos. It is of a planet doing exactly what plate tectonics says it should, with a handful of specific clocks running late at the same time, and the reason that matters for tonight is that it teaches us where to actually look. Not up at the sun, which cannot reach the faults, but along the plate boundaries themselves, where the real chain of cause and effect runs, fault to fault, stress to stress. But notice which boundary I keep circling back to, because out of every loaded fault on that list, there is one that has been silent the longest, one that sits directly beneath one of the most populated and unprepared coastlines on Earth, one whose deep edge has been shoving harder this very week. And it is not the Caribbean, and it is not Pakistan. It is the one in our own backyard, and there is a specific frightening reason scientists have started to wonder whether it might not move alone. Let me show you what happens when two of these giants are wired to go off together. Part 7. When two faults move as one. There is a second fault under the west coast, and you already know its name because it is the most famous fault in the world, the San Andreas. And while everyone has been arguing about sunspots, the southern stretch of the San Andreas has been doing the most ominous thing a fault can do, which is absolutely nothing at all. The San Andreas is a different kind of fault from Cascadia. It is not a subduction zone where one plate dives under another. It is a transform fault, a colossal sideways seam where the Pacific plate grinds northwest past the North American plate. You can stand on it, drive across it, photograph the fences and roads that have been visibly offset by its slow creep. That visibility is part of why it became the famous one. We have a vivid, photographed, documented memory of what it can do, because in 1906 its northern segment ruptured and burned San Francisco to the ground, an event seared into the national imagination in a way the silent offshore giant to the north never has been. The San Andreas gets the movies and the magazine covers. Cascadia, larger and quieter, gets forgotten precisely because it has never performed for a camera. And along much of its length, it relieves its stress in a steady, almost businesslike way, with moderate earthquakes every so often that bleed off the pressure before it can build to a catastrophe. But not everywhere. The far southern stretch of the San Andreas, the part running down toward the Salton Sea, has not produced a major rupture in over 300 years. The last great earthquake on the section to the north, the one near Fort Tillon, struck in 1857 and reached an estimated magnitude of about 7.9. The southern branch below it has been quiet even longer than that, and in all the time since, there has been no major release, no 6 or 7 on that southern segment to vent the pressure that has been accumulating the entire time. Here is why that quiet is the opposite of comforting. On a fault that releases stress regularly, you can think of it as paying its debts in small installments. On a fault that has gone silent for 3 centuries, the debt has just been compounding. The plates have kept moving the whole time, the strain has kept loading, and none of it has been paid down. When that southern section finally goes, most assessments put the maximum size near magnitude 8.1, and the reason it could be that large is precisely the length of locked fault that has gone untouched for so long. The longer the silent stretch, the longer the tear when it finally rips, and the bigger the earthquake. So picture the situation honestly. You have Cascadia, offshore to the north, locked for 326 years, and now the longest overdue it has ever been in the readable record, with its deep edge shoving harder this week. And you have the southern San Andreas, onshore to the south, locked for over 3 centuries, with the maximum stored strain it can hold. 2 of the most dangerous faults on the continent, both loaded, both quiet, both waiting, their territories nearly touching in northern California. And this is where a genuinely unsettling line of research comes in, the kind I want to label clearly as a hypothesis rather than a settled fact, because honesty about uncertainty is the whole point of this channel. Over the past several years, scientists have been examining the possibility that these 2 systems are not entirely independent of each other, that a great rupture on one could change the stress on the other, enough to bring it closer to its own failure. That, over the long sweep of geologic time, Cascadia and the northern San Andreas may have sometimes ruptured in close succession, one great earthquake nudging its neighbour toward the edge through exactly the kind of stress transfer we talked about a few minutes ago. I want to be very careful with this, because it is easy to turn a real scientific question into a doomsday cartoon. There is no credible claim that both faults are going to rupture next Tuesday, or that one is guaranteed to set off the other. What there is a serious, evidence-based question about whether 2 giant neighbouring fault systems, both loaded to historic levels, might be linked closely enough that the failure of one raises the odds for the other, not on a timescale of days, but as part of the same long story the Earth is telling. And when both of those systems are already as far along as they are right now, that question stops being academic and starts being the reason a careful scientist keeps the whole West Coast on the watch list at once, rather than treating each fault as a separate problem in a separate file. This is the connection the headlines should be making, and it is so much more grounded than the one about the sun. The real linkage is not sky to ground. It is fault to fault, stress to stress, one loaded giant standing close enough to another that when one finally moves, the ground itself carries the message. That is the dot worth connecting, not a flare and a fault. 2 faults, side by side, both out of time. It helps to understand how differently the San Andreas behaves along its length, because that difference is exactly what makes the southern silence so menacing. In the central part of the fault, around the middle of California, the 2 plates actually creep past each other more or less continuously. You can find spots where a curb or a fence built across the fault has been slowly bent and offset over the years, the ground quietly sliding without any great earthquake at all. That creeping section is, in a strange way, the safe part, because it is constantly relieving its own stress in small, harmless increments. It never lets enough build up to produce a catastrophe. The locked sections are the dangerous ones, and the San Andreas has 2 famous ones. To the north, the segment that ruptured in 1906 and destroyed San Francisco, a magnitude near 7.9 that tore some 400 kilometers of fault, and to the south, the segment that has not produced a great earthquake in living memory or in several lifetimes before that. The last major rupture on the section just north of the Deep South reached back to 1857, the Fort Tejon earthquake, also around magnitude 7.9, which tore a comparable length of fault and would, if it happened today, runs straight through a region that is now home to many millions of people. The far southern branch, running down toward the Salton Sea, has been locked even longer, and it sits right beside one of the largest population centres in the country. This is the part that turns an abstract hazard into a civic emergency in waiting. When the southern San Andreas finally ruptures, the ground motion will not be confined to some empty stretch of desert. It will run along the edge of an enormous metropolitan region, through the corridors that carry water and fuel and electricity into tens of millions of homes, many of those lifelines crossing the fault at right angles, exactly where a sudden offset of several meters does the most damage. The earthquake itself would likely be survivable for most who are not in the worst old buildings. The aftermath, the months without easy water or power across a region built on the assumption that those things simply arrive, is the harder problem, and it is the one emergency planners lose sleep over. Now bring the two giants back together, because this is the connection that actually deserves the dramatic music. We talked earlier about how earthquakes transfer stress to their neighbours, how a rupture on one fault redraws the pressure map around it, and can load a nearby fault closer to failure. We have watched that happen in real time, in cases where one earthquake clearly handed stress to an adjacent fault that then failed in turn within hours or years. That is the established physical reality of how faults talk to each other. Now apply that same principle not to two small faults, but to two of the largest systems on the continent, sitting nearly shoulder to shoulder in Northern California, both locked, both loaded to historic levels. The research that examines whether Cascadia and the San Andreas might be linked is built on exactly that principle. The question the scientists are asking is whether a great rupture on one of these systems could transfer enough stress to the other to bring it measurably closer to its own failure, and whether, over the long geologic record, the two have sometimes gone in close succession because of it. I want to be careful and label this clearly as an open question rather than a settled fact, because the timescales involved are long and the evidence is still being assembled. There is no responsible version of this that says both faults rupture next week, but there is a responsible version that says when two neighbouring giants are both this far along, the possibility that one could nudge the other is no longer a fringe thought. It is a serious line of inquiry, and it is one more reason a careful scientist watches the entire West Coast as a single system, rather than as separate, unrelated problems. And we know the southern San Andreas is overdue the same way we know about Cascadia, by digging into the fault itself and reading its history. Across decades, scientists have cut trenches directly across the San Andreas and exposed the layers of soil and sediment that the fault has sliced and offset over thousands of years. Each past earthquake leaves a tear in those layers, a buried scar, and by dating the soil above and below each scar, researchers have built a timeline of when this fault has ruptured going back well over 1,000 years. What that record shows for the southern segment is a fault that has produced major earthquakes every century or two on average, and that has now gone far longer than that typical spacing without one. The same logic that makes Cascadia frightening makes the southern San Andreas frightening. The clock has run past its usual alarm, and nothing has reset it. Put the two timelines side by side and the picture sharpens into something genuinely sobering. Cascadia, offshore to the north, past the longest gap in its readable record. The southern San Andreas, onshore to the south, past the typical spacing of its own long history. Two independent clocks, built on two different kinds of fault, both reading late, both loaded, their territories nearly touching in the same corner of Northern California, where this week's tremor has been running hot. You do not need either one to trigger the other for that to be alarming. Two overloaded systems in the same region is its own kind of warning, whether or not they are wired together, and the live possibility that they might be wired together is simply the sharpest edge of an already sharp situation. So this is the dot worth connecting, the one the headlines should be drawing instead of the one about the sun. Not a flare and a fault, separated by 93 million miles and an impossible energy gap. Two faults separated by almost nothing, wired together through the solid rock they share, both of them out of time at the same time. So let me take you to the moment everyone on the West Coast lives in quiet denial of, the moment the longest silent of these faults finally lets go, because understanding what that day actually looks like is the only thing that makes all of this matter. And it is the clearest possible answer to the question of why scientists cannot look away. Part 8. The day it lets go. When the Cascadia subduction zone finally ruptures along its full length, the first thing that will happen is that the locked zone, all those hundreds of kilometers of welded plate boundary, will tear free more or less at once, and the ground will shake not for the few seconds most people associate with an earthquake, but for something closer to 4 or 5 minutes. I want you to actually try to sit with that length of time because it changes everything. A few seconds of shaking is terrifying and survivable. 4 or 5 minutes of violent ground motion is a different category of event. It is long enough for the unreinforced buildings to come down, long enough for soils to liquefy and swallow foundations, long enough for the failures to cascade into one another, bridges and overpasses and old brick facades all reaching their limit in sequence rather than all at once. The shaking, though, is only the opening act, because Cascadia's defining horror is the water. The same sudden drop of the coastline that drowned those cedar forests in 1700 will happen again, the bulged-up land snapping downward by a metre or more in an instant, and the ocean will rush in to fill the new low ground. Offshore, the upward lurch of the seafloor will shove the entire water column skyward and launch a tsunami toward the coast. For the towns along that shoreline, the time between the end of the shaking and the arrival of the first wave will be measured in minutes, not hours, minutes. There will be no time to wait for an official warning, because for the people on that coast, the shaking is the warning, the only one they will get, and it will not stay local. The wave that crossed the Pacific in 1700 and flooded Japan with no felt earthquake will cross it again. Hawaii, Alaska, the coasts of Japan, the entire Pacific Rim sits in the path of a great Cascadia tsunami. Millions of people, across thousands of miles of coastline, are downstream of that single locked zone off the coast of the Pacific Northwest. That is the scale of the thing that has been silent for 326 years. We know it can reach that far because it already did. The orphan tsunami that flooded Japanese villages in 1700 crossed the entire breadth of the Pacific Ocean to get there. A journey of about 9 or 10 hours, arriving with no earthquake felt beforehand to warn anyone what was coming. That single fact, a wave large enough to be recorded a full ocean away, is the measure of the energy stored in this boundary, and it cuts both ways across the Pacific. The great earthquakes that strike the other side, off Japan, off Kamchatka, off Chile, send their own tsunamis toward North America, which is why the West Coast and Hawaii live downstream of the entire ring, not just of their own faults. The ocean is a single connected basin, and a great rupture anywhere along its rim sends a message to every shore. What makes the homegrown version so much more dangerous for the Pacific Northwest is the lack of warning time. When a tsunami is generated on the far side of the ocean, there are hours to issue alerts and move people to safety, and the warning networks that ring the Pacific are built precisely for that. But a tsunami generated just offshore, by the local fault, arrives in minutes, before any official system can analyze the earthquake and push an alert. For those communities, the technology that protects against distant tsunamis cannot help against the local one. The only warning is the ground itself shaking long and hard, which is why the single most important thing a coastal resident can know is that long shaking means move to high ground now, on foot, without waiting for anyone to tell you. I'm not telling you this to frighten you into paralysis, and I'm certainly not telling you to flee the West Coast, because that is neither realistic nor the point. The point is the gap between how certain this event is over the long run and how unprepared most people are for it. We know it is coming. We know roughly what it will look like because the Earth has left us the receipts from every previous time. What we do not know and cannot know is the date. And that combination, near total certainty about the what and near total ignorance about the when, is the hardest kind of risk for human beings to hold in their heads. It is so much easier to either panic or ignore it than to do the boring, durable thing in between, which is to be quietly ready. And being ready as genuinely possible, which is the part I want you to leave with rather than the dread. On much of the West Coast there are now early warning systems that can detect the first faster-moving waves of energy from an earthquake and send an alert to phones in the seconds before the slower, destructive shaking arrives. Seconds do not sound like much, until you realize that a few seconds is enough time to stop, to get away from windows, to drop, to cover your head, to take your hands off a scalpel or pull a car to the shoulder. The whole discipline of earthquake survival comes down to a few unglamorous habits. Know that when the ground moves, you drop, you take cover under something solid, and you hold on. Know that if you're on the coast and the shaking is long, You do not wait for a siren. You move to high ground the moment it stops. Keep the boring supplies. Make the boring plan. These are the things that turn a catastrophe into something survivable, and they cost almost nothing except the willingness to take the threat seriously before it arrives. None of it requires you to predict anything. That is the quiet genius of preparation as a strategy. You do not need to know the day, the month, or the year, because the supplies in the closet and the plan in your head are equally useful whenever the ground decides to move. A weather forecast that is wrong wastes your umbrella. A house that is ready for an earthquake that has not come yet has lost you nothing at all and stands ready for the one that eventually will. Preparation is the rare response to uncertainty that is never wasted, because it does not depend on getting the timing right. It only depends on being ready before the timing, whatever it turns out to be, arrives. It is worth pausing on a contrast here, because this same week, out in the Pacific, a volcano in Hawaii has been building toward another episode of its ongoing eruption, its summit swelling with magma, the instruments showing it inflating past the level seen before its last burst of fountaining, and scientists have been able to say with real confidence that another episode is likely within hours. That is what it looks like when the Earth gives you a warning you can read. A volcano like that announces itself. It inflates, it rumbles, it tips its hand, and the people watching can see it coming. The locked fault gives you none of that. It does not inflate in a way you can feel. It does not rumble a warning the night before. It sits in total silence, exactly as it has for 3 centuries, right up until the moment it does not. And that, more than any sunspot, more than any solar flare, is the thing that should keep our eyes on the West Coast. Not because the sky is dangerous, but because the ground is patient, and its patience is almost gone. Let me make the aftermath concrete, because vague dread does not help anyone, but a clear picture does. During those minutes of shaking, soft and waterlogged soils in low-lying areas can lose their strength entirely in a process called liquefaction, where saturated ground briefly behaves like a liquid, and buildings tilt or sink and underground pipes float upward. Liquefaction is one of those phenomena that sounds like science fiction until you have seen the footage from past earthquakes. Solid-looking ground, a parking lot, a field, a street, suddenly behaving like a thick liquid, water and sand bubbling up through cracks, heavy buildings tilting over as their foundations lose all support, buried tanks and pipes floating upward out of the soil because the ground around them can no longer hold them down. It happens where loose, water-saturated sediment gets shaken hard enough that the grains briefly lose contact with one another and the whole mass flows. Much of the developed land along bays, rivers and old waterfronts sits on exactly that kind of soil, often on ground that was artificially filled in long ago, and that is precisely where some of the most populated and valuable real estate on the West Coast happens to be. The shaking decides how hard the ground is hit. The soil decides how badly it fails. The structures most at risk are the older ones built before modern earthquake codes, the unreinforced brick and concrete that still make up parts of every older city. The newer, well-engineered buildings will mostly stand, which is the quiet triumph of decades of better building codes. But the lifelines that thread between them, the water mains, the gas lines, the fuel pipelines, the bridges, are the vulnerable connective tissue, and many of them were not built for 4 or 5 minutes of violent motion. For the coastal communities, the problem compounds because the same stretch of coastline that faces the tsunami is also the part most likely to be cut off after the shaking. Roads buckle, bridges fail, and the narrow corridors that connect the coast to the interior can close in moments, leaving coastal towns isolated, unable to receive help quickly and unable to evacuate easily by road. That is why the standing advice for anyone on that coast is so blunt. If you are near the ocean and the shaking lasts a long time, you do not wait, you do not drive, you move on foot to high ground immediately because the wave may be only minutes behind the shaking, and the shaking is the only warning you will get. We have watched versions of this happen elsewhere, and those events are the reason no serious scientist treats the Cascadia scenario as exaggerated. In 2004, a great subduction earthquake off Sumatra generated a tsunami that killed on the order of 200,000 people around the Indian Ocean, many of them with no warning at all. In 2011, the Japanese coast, one of the best prepared coastlines on Earth, with seawalls and drills and warning systems, was still overwhelmed by a tsunami that exceeded the defences built for it. Those were not failures of knowledge. Japan knew its risk. They were demonstrations of how much force these boundaries unleash when they finally move, and how the largest events have a way of exceeding the assumptions built around them. Cascadia is the same kind of boundary, facing a coastline with far less of that hard-won preparation after a far longer silence. The recovery from a full Cascadia rupture would not be measured in days or weeks. Honest assessments talk about parts of the affected region facing months without normal water, power or fuel, and far longer to rebuild the ports, bridges and pipelines that a modern economy runs on. That is the part that is genuinely hard to absorb, because we're used to disasters as events with a clear before and after, and this would be more like a long, grinding interruption of the basic systems we never think about until they stop. There is a human dimension to that long recovery that I do not want to skip past, because it is where preparation matters most and where it is most often neglected. In the immediate aftermath of a great earthquake, the official help that everyone instinctively expects, the first responders, the relief convoys, the restored power, will be stretched impossibly thin across an enormous affected area, and for the hardest hit places it may be days before any of it arrives. That means the people who actually save lives in the first hours are almost always the ordinary people already there. The neighbours who know which house has an elderly resident, who knows first aid, who has a shut-off wrench for the gas line. The communities that come through these events best are not the ones with the most dramatic emergency plans on paper. They are the ones where people know each other, where a block has talked about what it would do, where preparation is a shared habit rather than a private chore. And there is a psychological piece worth naming, because the long interruption is what breaks people who are ready for the shaking, but not for what came after. We are wired to expect disasters to end, to have a clear morning after when things start returning to normal. A great subduction earthquake does not offer that clean arc. It offers weeks of improvisation, of boiling water, of checking on neighbours, of patience while the slow work of rebuilding lifelines grinds forward. Knowing that in advance, expecting the marathon rather than the sprint, is itself a form of preparation, because the people who understand what they are walking into are far less likely to panic when the lights do not come back on the second day. Readiness is not only supplies in a closet, it is a realistic picture in your head of what the days afterward actually look like. But I promised you that the takeaway would be readiness rather than despair, and I meant it, because the gap between a prepared household and an unprepared one in the days after a great earthquake is enormous, and closing that gap is almost entirely within your control. The advice is unglamorous precisely because it works. Keep enough water and food to get through at least a couple of weeks on your own, because outside help may not arrive quickly. Know whether your home or your workplace or your child's school sits inside a tsunami zone, and know the route to high ground from each of them. Secure the heavy furniture that could fall on someone during minutes of shaking. Have a plan for how your family reconnects when the phones are down, and learn the single most important reflex, the one that saves lives in the first seconds. When the ground moves, you drop to the floor, you take cover under something solid, and you hold on until it stops. The early warning systems now running along much of the West Coast can buy you a few of those seconds. They work by catching the first, faster, less destructive wave of energy that races out ahead of the slower, violent shaking, and turning that head start into an alert on your phone. A few seconds does not sound like much, but it is enough to stop, to get under a desk, to pull off the road, to step back from a hazard. It is the difference between being caught flat-footed and being braced. These systems are one of the genuine gifts of modern earthquake science, and they cost you nothing but the willingness to pay attention when the alert comes. So let us come all the way back to the question we started with, the one about the sun and the trigger, because now that you have seen the whole picture, the answer means something very different than it did at the beginning. Part 9. The trigger was never the point. We began with 2 loaded things in the same week. A fault under the West Coast, locked for 326 years and shoving harder this week than it has in a month. And a sunspot overhead, oversized and tangled and turning to face us, with the odds of a major flare ticking upward. And the question that wrote itself was whether the second could set off the first. We have come a long way from that question, so let me gather the whole journey into one place. We saw the tremor surge beneath Northern California and learned that the quiet slipping below is loading the locked zone above, not relieving it. We read the seafloor's diary and the buried marshes and the dead forests, and found a fault that has gone longer without rupturing than any interval in its 4,000-year record. We climbed up to the sun and met a genuinely impressive sunspot, and then we tested, mechanism by mechanism, whether it could reach the fault and found that it cannot by a margin of about 1,000,000,000 to 1. We toured the busy seismic week and separated the real way faults influence each other, fault to fault through the solid rock, from the false way people imagine the sun does it. And we stood beside the second giant, the southern San Andreas, just as silent and just as loaded, close enough to the first that scientists now study whether the two might be linked. Every one of those threads led to the same place. The danger is in the ground, it is real, it is advanced, and it does not depend on anything happening in the sky. The sun was the loud distraction. The fault was the quiet truth the whole time. Now you know the answer. The sun cannot pull the trigger. The energy is wrong by a factor of 1,000,000,000. The statistics show no fingerprint, and the physics has no mechanism. The flash in the sky and the strain in the ground are two separate stories that happen to share a calendar. If you take only one thing from tonight, let it be that the next time someone tells you a solar storm is about to crack the continent, you will know exactly why it will not. But I told you at the start that the honest answer would unsettle you more than the scary one, and here is why. When you believe the sun is the trigger, you get to feel like there is a warning system. You get to imagine that we will see the flare, track the storm, count down the hours, and brace ourselves. The cosmic trigger story is frightening, but it is also secretly comforting, because it implies a fuse we can watch burn. Take the sun away, and that comfort goes with it. Because the truth is that the fault was never waiting on a spark. It does not need one. The strain is already stored, already past the longest interval in the record, already loaded onto a locked zone that the deep slipping below keeps pressing harder every week. There is no fuse to watch. There is no countdown. There is only a threshold buried in the rock that we cannot see and cannot measure precisely, and a slow, patient accumulation that crosses that threshold on a day the Earth will not announce in advance. This is the part of the story that asks the most of us, because human beings are built to respond to warnings, and the most dangerous thing about this particular threat is that the warning and the event are the same moment. With a hurricane, you get days. With a wildfire, you can often see the smoke. With a volcano like the one in Hawaii this week, you get the swelling and the rumbling that let scientists say it is coming within hours. But with the locked fault, the first unambiguous sign that it is happening is the shaking itself, and by then the time for everything except your reflexes is gone. There is no version of this where we get to be warned and then prepare. The preparing has to happen now in the calm, against an event that gives its notice and its arrival in the same instant. That is the uncomfortable inversion at the centre of all of this. For every other threat, watching is a form of safety. For this one, watching is almost useless, because there is nothing to see until it is too late to act on it. The only thing that translates into safety is what you did beforehand, while the ground was still quiet and the danger still felt abstract, which means the people who treat the quiet as permission to do nothing are making the one mistake this fault punishes most, and the people who treat the quiet as the time to get ready are doing the only thing that actually works. That is why scientists cannot look away from the West Coast right now, not because the sun is dangerous, though it can wreck a satellite and light up a sky. They cannot look away because two of the most dangerous faults on the continent are both loaded to historic levels, sitting almost shoulder to shoulder, one of them shoving harder this very week. And because the thing that finally moves them will come from inside the Earth, on the Earth's schedule, with the kind of silence that gives no one time to get ready who was not already ready. And so the real question is not the one we started with. It was never going to be, will the sun set it off? The sun is a distraction, a loud light in the sky that pulled our eyes up while the danger sat patiently down below. The real question is the one that should have been asked all along. If the fault is already cocked, if the strain is already there, if the silence has already outrun every record we have, then what exactly are we waiting for? And when the only warning is the shaking itself, would we even recognize the final sign in time to do the one thing that matters, which is to be ready before it comes? Think back over everything we have laid out, and notice how every thread runs the same direction. The tremor surge under Northern California is the deep boundary pressing on the locked zone. The 326-year silence is the locked zone holding more than any record can match. The busy seismic week around the world is the planet's plates pressing on one another, fault to fault, exactly as they always have. The southern San Andreas is a second-loaded giant standing close enough to the first to matter, and the sunspot, the one thing that pointed our attention upward, turns out to be the one thing in the whole story that cannot touch the ground at all. Every real thread points down into the rock, only the false one points up into the sky. There is a reason we wanted the false one to be true, and it is worth naming, because naming it is how you stop being fooled by it next time. We wanted the sun to be the trigger because a trigger we can see is a trigger we can prepare for. A burning fuse, however frightening, at least gives you the dignity of a countdown. What the science actually leaves us with is harder to hold, a threshold buried in rock that we cannot measure precisely, and a slow accumulation that will cross it on a day the Earth refuses to announce. There is no fuse, there is only the quiet, and then there is not. I keep coming back to that contrast with the volcano in Hawaii, because it is the perfect mirror. That volcano this week has been swelling, rumbling, tipping its hand so clearly that scientists can say another eruption is likely within hours. It gives a warning you can read. The locked fault gives nothing. It does not inflate where you can feel it. It does not rumble the night before. It offers the same flat silence it has offered for 3 centuries, right up until the instant it does not. And then the shaking itself is the only notice anyone gets. The Earth, it turns out, keeps 2 kinds of time. The loud kind, like a volcano that you can watch approach, and the silent kind, like a locked megathrust, that you can only prepare for in advance, because by the time it speaks, the time to get ready is already gone. There is a strange kind of peace available on the other side of accepting this, and I want to offer it to you, because dread is not the goal. Once you stop waiting for a trigger, once you stop scanning the sky for a sign that will never come, the anxiety actually has somewhere to go. It can become action instead of fear. The uncertainty that feels unbearable when you're passively waiting becomes manageable the moment you turn it into preparation, because preparation is the one response to an unpredictable threat that always makes sense, no matter when the threat arrives. You will never know the date. You are never going to know the date. But you can be the household that has water, the family that has a plan, the person who drops and covers without thinking. And having done that, you can actually put the fear down and go live your life, which is the whole point. People sometimes ask whether they should leave, whether the responsible thing is to move away from the coast entirely. That is a personal decision, and I am not here to make it for anyone, but I will say that the answer for the overwhelming majority of people is no, that you can live a full life on top of one of these faults the same way millions already do, provided you treat the risk with the seriousness it deserves, rather than the denial it usually gets. The danger is not that people live there. The danger is that they live there as if the ground beneath them were a settled, finished thing, when it is in fact a slow machine winding toward a release. You do not have to flee the machine. You only have to stop pretending it is not running. So the practical message and the philosophical message turn out to be the same message. Get ready now, in the quiet, because the quiet is the only part you're guaranteed to get. Keep the water and the plan and the supplies. Know your ground, know your high ground, know the reflex of drop and cover and hold. Not out of fear, but out of respect for a process that is patient and certain and indifferent to whether we happen to be paying attention. The people who will come through the best are not the ones who guessed the date. No one guesses the date. They are the ones who treated the certainty seriously while the ground was still calm. The ground beneath the west coast has been keeping a secret for 326 years. It is not a secret about the sun. It is a secret about time, about how long a thing can hold before it breaks, and about how little notice the most important events give before they arrive. The sky put on a show this week, but if you want to know where the real story is, do not look up, look down. And then, quietly, without panic and without denial, get ready. Because the one thing the rock has told us, clearly and without a single word, is that it is almost done waiting.